Jews have been a part of North Carolina life since the very beginning of our colonial experience, and their history is rich and complex. And now it's told in a most interesting way by Leonard Rogoff in a new book, Down Home, Jewish Life in North Carolina. And we'll talk to Dr. Rogoff on North Carolina Bookwatch next.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Welcome to North Carolina Bookwatch. I'm D.G. Martin, and my guest is Leonard Rogoff. He's the author of Down Home, Jewish Life in North Carolina. Welcome, Leonard Rogoff.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks very much. You're the research historian for the Jewish Heritage Foundation. Been in North Carolinian for a long time. Got your PhD in history here at the University of North Carolina.
English, actually.
Is it in English?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't do my research well enough, but your research in Down Home Jewish Life in North Carolina is extraordinary. I'd like for you to tell us what the objectives of this book is and how you came to write it.
Well, we were aware that our neighboring states, Virginia and South Carolina, had done multimedia presentations of their own Jewish histories, and North Carolina is a proverbial veil of humility between two mountains of conceit, and in Virginia and South Carolina there was very rich Jewish history going back to the colonial era, and it was not thought that North Carolina really had a Jewish history. So it was a story that was waiting to be told. And not only had it not really been presented in a book or an exhibition, but it had not really even been fundamentally researched other than some excellent local community histories and a few biographies. So it was an opportunity waiting to be realized.
Well, one of the great things in your book for me was that although my impression was that the Jewish presence in North Carolina came fairly recently, at least in waves, but you, through your research and that of others, show that the Jewish presence been here since the time of the Lost Colony and before.
Yeah, that one of the interesting things when we went looking to see if there were Jews there, almost at any time and place, we almost invariably found them. And we found one among the 108 settlers on Sir Walter Raleigh's second expedition to Roanoke Island in 1585. So we've known that they've been there since the earliest days of North Carolina history. But I think your first comment is actually more apropos, because generally when they do these histories, they look for the very first. And again, in the histories of Virginia and South Carolina, the focus is going to be on the colonial era, the early republic, the antebellum and Civil War. But North Carolina's Jewish history, like the history of the state, really achieves its strongest significance with the New South and Sun Belt.
Well, let's talk about that next, but let's talk a little bit about some of the interesting history that you bring up about the pre-Civil War and Civil War in the 19th century. Jews were very present in North Carolina, just not maybe in great numbers.
Well, it's a typical historical situation for the Jews, that their significance in the society is far greater than their actual numbers. For example, when North Carolina wrote its state constitution in 1776, there was a question of instituting a religious test, and that occupied a third of the debate at the Constitutional Convention. And the question focused on the propriety of Jews serving in public office. So the 1776 Constitution reads that only a believer in the truth of the Protestant religion can serve in public office in North Carolina.
So theoretically, at least Catholics and Jews, and as well as other religious sects, were precluded from serving as officer soldiers, but it didn't exactly work out that way, did it?
The operative word is theoretically, because we had William Gaston in the General Assembly, and his brother-in-law Taylor was our Supreme Court justice, and they were both Roman Catholic. And in 1808, a Jew, Jacob Henry, was elected to the state legislature from Beaufort, Craven County, and his right to serve was challenged a year later on the grounds that he was a Jew.
Early on, Jews found a challenge, maybe even more difficult in the earlier times, in terms of managing, getting along in society, but maintaining their Jewishness. So you found instances of some families who became quite prominent in North Carolina, and their descendants are both Christians, non-religious people, and loyal, faithful Jews.
Yeah, the most distinguished early family in North Carolina Jewish history was, as they pronounce it down here, the Mordekeys. And Jacob and his two wives, Judith and Rebecca, he had married a half-sister after his first wife had died. They were both observant, traditional Orthodox Jews, but their children realized every possibility that you could in free America. Some of their children remained Jewish, some of them converted, one of them became an evangelical Christian, others were religiously indifferent.
Part of the challenge was that there weren't a whole bunch of Jews here, so that the development of places to worship was difficult.
Yeah, you didn't have a congregation, so those who were affiliated generally went to Richmond or to Charleston, which had thriving Jewish communities. But we also have evidence of a circuit riding rabbis coming down. For instance, you'll see a wedding in the, I guess it was the 1840s or 1850s, in a little town like Bethany, for example, and a rabbi comes down from Richmond, or in the we have a peddler who did had a second career as a ritual circumciser, and he kept a diary, and he's doing ritual circumcisions in North Carolina in the 1850s. So they had ways of keeping up their religiosity.
About the time of the Civil War and afterwards, the railroads got started and opened up North Carolina. And as you point out in your book, the railroad sort of opened up a different and new pathway for commerce and for a Jewish presence in North Carolina. How did that work?
Well, you know, Jews tend to be an urban and commercial people. So like anyone else, you want to settle in a place where you can make a living. So when the sea-coastal lanes and the port cities dominated the state's economy, that's where you find the early Jews in New Bern and Wilmington. And as the North Carolina Railroad spreads out in the 1850s, you see these little market and mill towns start sprouting along the rail lines. And very often I see, you know, in local histories they'll say, and the Jews arrived with the coming of the railroad, because commerce came into town. They needed stores. They could bring produce or their merchandise down from Baltimore or from Charleston. So the railroad opened up opportunities for settlement.
There's another image that many of us have about Jewish presence, and that is that the Jews came first as peddlers with a backpack, walking from place to place selling to farmers. Then they made enough money to buy a wagon, and they expanded their trade. And then they were able to move into a store, and they set up what some people called the Jew store in the city. And then some of them used the commercial success to expand into manufacturing, and you have a group of successful. Now, how close to being true is that viewpoint?
Well, you know, as a friend of mine once said, you know, stereotypes are generally true. It may not be true in every individual case, but that's pretty much the profile. They came down, they were impoverished, they came down short of skills and capital, and they began peddling and saved up their cash and found a place, usually along a rail line, that offered opportunities for a store, maybe a mill open there, and that's how they established themselves.
Where did these people come from?
Well, there's a generally, they talk about a three-wave history of American Jewish immigration, and there was a very, very small early on in the 18th century to the early 19th of Spanish Portuguese Jews, and we find a few of them in North Carolina. But the larger migration was of the German Jews who started to come in the 1820s, 1840s, up till about the 1880s. Several hundred thousand came to the United States then, and then from the 1880s to the 1920s, until America shut its gates to immigration, several million East European Jews came to America, and North Carolina follows that.
Why were the first the German Jews in the earlier times, why were they coming, and then why were the Eastern European Jews coming to America?
Well, there's always a push and pull to immigration, and the push is always, for the Jews at least, it was poverty and persecution. For example, in some of the German municipalities, only the oldest son could marry. Or so if you wanted to get married, you had to leave your hometown, your place of residence. There were anti-Jewish riots in Germany in the 1830s. But the major push, I think, and pull was economic opportunity. These were an impoverished people. They were restricted in terms of land owning or the trades that they could pursue. So America offered opportunity, and that's what drew them to the United States, and that's what eventually pulled them down here to North Carolina.
Same thing with the Eastern European Jews?
The same thing, and the East European Jewish migration is usually dated till 1881, after the assassination of the liberal Tsar Alexander II, and pogroms, anti-Jewish riots broke out across Eastern Europe. But it's really also, Jews had very high birth rates, and they were confined residentially as to where they could live, and that was the push to come to America. And we see evidence of that. There's typically, we're doing a little educational video, and the scene that we set up is is a Russian Jewish family reading a letter from a relative in North Carolina, come to America. And that was a typical story. It was a family chain migration. I always like my favorite quote from the historian Jacob Rader Marcus is that no Jew was ever the first to come to a community. He was always preceded by his uncle. And that's how it is. The uncle came and he sent a letter home and brought his niece and nephew or children, and they brought their family. And
well, I'd love for you to give us some examples. I hadn't warned you about this, but I'd love to have an example maybe of a North Carolina Jewish family with this German origin and compared with a North Carolina family that we might know about that has an Eastern European origin. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, it's a fair question. In many respects, their patterns were the same. Usually a male, for example, we have probably one of our most prominent families are the Wheel family of Goldsboro. And Herman Wheel came to Goldsboro in the 1850s, shortly after the North Carolina Railroad arrived. And he already had a sister here who had married into a peddler by the name of Ettinger. The Ettinger family is still around. He came here and he started to peddle and clerk in his brother-in-law's store, and then he opened up a store of his own. Then he drew he served in the Confederate Army, drew 3 of his brothers down, and the Wheel Brothers store anchored downtown Goldsboro, and it expanded into a plywood factory, a fertilizer factory. They got involved in scientific agriculture. They bought farmland. They donated the cliffs of New State Park to North Carolina, and they were a well-established North Carolina family. A similar family.
They were German.
They were German, Bavarian Jews. We had their correspondences in state archives going back to the 1850s, and it's all in this kind of Judeo-German dialect.
And what about an Eastern European example of a family?
Well, typically, we repeatedly heard this story again and again. Families I could identify, like the Munichs, for example, in Oxford, North Carolina, or the DeLugans in Wilmington, the Leibovitzes in Gastonia. Um, Typically, they were immigrants who arrived in Baltimore, and Baltimore was the Baltimore Bargain House, which was, I believe, the largest wholesaler in the United States, and it was operated by a man by the name of Jacob Epstein, who himself was a Lithuanian immigrant who had peddled the countryside, and he had become fabulously wealthy. I think the store occupied something like 6 acres, had 160,000 customers, but Epstein himself was a Jewish immigrant who had a soft spot for his fellow immigrants, and he had Yiddish-speaking agents on the docks and the railroad station at Baltimore, and he would bring these agents into his wholesale house, these immigrants, and he would point at a map and say, there's a new mill going up in Roanoke Rapids. They could use the store. I'll give you the credit and merchandise and set you up there.
So by this time it skipped the peddler stage and went directly into
No, they were peddling. They started out. I mean, well, it might have skipped. He might have set them up in the store, but very often the store, I heard, actually he gave them the merchandise to peddle. I mean, that's
and
a
worked your
correction.
way up into
And
the
you
store.
worked your way up. Yes, I'll give you some pins and needles and some fabric, and or sometimes he would set them up in the store. But even if he had a store, very commonly you would have the store, but your brother or nephew or cousin was out taking merchandise from the store and going out into the countryside.
Wow.
So,
Well, I would love to talk about this the rest of the time, but you mentioned that the real, I don't want to call it tidal wave, but the wave of Jews coming to North Carolina came as a part of the sort of New South.
yeah.
And how did that happen, and how did it differ from the 19th century experience?
In many ways, it was very, very similar. It was more, I guess, a question of the scale of the development that took place, the industrialization of what they call the New South. I mean, you see traces of it, certainly of mills and so on, well before the Civil War. But in the New South era, there was just this explosion in the growth of tobacco towns, textile mills, and the extent of the state's urbanization just grew at a very, very accelerated pace, and with it, the growth of the Jewish community.
Some of the stories that you tell, I'm interested in a number of these families, some in manufacturing and some in the expansion of the retail business. The Cohn family story is one of the most interesting ones, and can you tell that briefly?
Yeah. Herman Kahn, I guess his name was originally, came in the 1840s as an immigrant, settled in Richmond and then Virginia, and then moved to Tennessee, and then established himself in Baltimore, where he had a wholesale house. And again, he sent out his sons, including his 2 sons, Moses and Caesar, and they were in some sense peddlers and salesmen. They headed down to North Carolina by train, and then either by wagon or on foot they would sell merchandise to country stores and also to the mill stores that were popping up in these newly developing mill villages. And then they started to take, in this cash-poor economy, they would take fabric in exchange for merchandise. And then they started to invest in mills, and then they started to build mills. And by the 1890s, I think they were building the South's largest textile mills in Greensboro. They produced a third of the denim manufactured in the United States.
An amazing story of wealth creation from poverty, really, to great wealth in a short period of time.
Yeah, it's a typical story in its pattern, maybe not in the scale of it. You know, obviously, not every peddler succeeded, and I guess we tend to focus on the peddlers who persisted. But peddling was a very rough and dangerous profession. We have several instances of peddlers who were murdered while out in the countryside. You were carrying, maybe 160 pounds on your back. You had one pack on your back. You had a balancer in the front. You knocked on farmhouse doors. Sometimes you slept in fields or barns, or maybe you could trade a thimble, and people would give you a room for a night. So they were very, very eager to get out of that profession.
Well, one of the other important things, I guess, about Jewish life is that many of these families that succeeded have been very generous in terms of their community spirit.
Well, we hear that phrase "giving back" a lot. Jews tend to be a very, very communal people, and they were very well received in these communities. And I hear repeatedly when I do oral histories the sense of gratitude that they felt for their success. And
well, that's the positive side of it, and it's ironic. You hear these stories, and you capture them in your book Down Home about people who say, I was just totally accepted in the community I grew up in. It was a wonderful experience, and we went to the Christian church, and they visited us, and everything was fine. And then there's a little story about some incidences in which they were really harassed or verbally abused, or that they encountered some kind of discrimination, they couldn't get in the country club, couldn't join the fraternity, something that really hurt them. And is that a typical story as well?
Yeah, typically what they say, we really felt welcome and never felt any prejudice. I always felt a part of this community. Have such gratitude for the reception we received here. And then they say, but. And then after the but, usually comes a story of exclusion or of insult and so on. But they typically do not want that to be the story that typifies
it's
their
almost
experience.
as if we talk about it, it's going to keep on happening. If we pretend it didn't happen, then maybe it'll go away.
Well, it's interesting. When I had a panel the other day of some old-time residents, and typically the Jewish newcomers here feel that the Southern Jews are in denial about some of their negative experiences. Yes, and I have documented in the book a Jewish salesman who was grabbed by a Klan mob in the 1920s and allegedly for flirting with a man's girlfriend, and he was grabbed and castrated. And we see evidence of peddlers, again, who were murdered. Whether they were murdered just for their cash or out of prejudice, we don't know. But
mentioning the Klan points out another really complicated part of your story, and that is the relationship between Jews and blacks in North Carolina and in the South, in terms of, in one sense, Jews were seen as being leaders on the white side of accommodation and desegregation and fairness. On the other side, it not always appreciated by African Americans. It's been a complicated relationship, and was it troublesome for you to tell the story?
Well, again, this was another interesting thing. The subject of Jews and blacks is, there's libraries of literature that have been written on it. But North Carolina's story, again, is a story that's not really been researched and told, but it seemed to me that the position of Jews was very much akin to their social and economic position, which is that they were in the middle. They were middlemen. They were, for a longest time, well until World War II, Jews were regarded as a separate race. And there was some question as to their racial status, whether they, again, they were white people, but on the other hand, they weren't Christian people. And certainly Jews held slaves and fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, but they, when the Civil Rights era conflict came, Jews again found themselves caught in the middle. They tended to be silent. They tended, synagogues were bombed in Gastonia and in Charlotte. Actually, the bombings, they were in a whisker of being bombs. They were caught before they exploded. So the Jews were quite anxious during this era.
We just got a minute, and this is another great story for a whole session. But I don't want to conclude the conversation without giving you a chance to talk about you've done the history. What about the future of Jews in North Carolina?
Well, about a couple of years ago, I did a study of Jews and Jewish congregational development. I counted 28 congregations. A few years later, I counted 41. And the Jewish growth, and it's like the general growth of North Carolina, development of North Carolina into a multicultural state. And there are Jewish groups popping up all over the place. Kitty Hawk, Boone's building a new congregation. Lake Norman, Pinehurst, which once had anti-Jewish covenants in their housing code, now has a temple on their main street. So the Jewish population is growing just as North Carolina is growing.
More open politically, socially now than in the past?
I would say for the past 400 years, Jews have felt very, very welcome in North Carolina. And one aspect of it is all the Jewish mayors all over the state.
Oh, yeah. Well, we should list them, but it would take a whole program to do that. Leonard Rogoff, thanks for your book, Down Home Jewish Life in North Carolina, and thanks for taking time to visit with us about it today.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks to all of you for listening. This has been North Carolina Bookwatch. Our guest has been Leonard Rogoff, author of Down Home Jewish Life in North Carolina. I'll be right back here same time next week. I hope you'll join me, and if you do, I'll introduce you to the work of another great North Carolina writer.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.